Good afternoon. Welcome to our final Conversations in Philanthropy for this spring. My name is Rob Fisher. I'm on the faculty here at the Mandel School, Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. I want to welcome you all this afternoon to what I think will be a really interesting conversation. And I'll introduce our panelists in just a moment. I wanted to set the stage a bit and have us all reflect personally for a moment. All of us in the room are donors of some type, whether we give cash gifts or other liquid assets, in-kind donations, potentially bequests at some point, used items, even our own organs as organ donors. So all of those, and including a whole host of volunteerism type opportunities, call on that philanthropic donor spirit that we all have. And the kernel behind our panel tonight was to spend a little time talking specifically about what goes on in the minds of donors. And for that lens, what we're focusing on is more, if you think about the top end of the scale, the major gifts, those that have over their lifetime committed substantial resources to their giving. And all of us, I'm sure if we totaled it up over our own lifetimes, would be shocked by the number that we would see, even from modest giving. But our panelists are going to help us think about this, and we're going to start with each of them offering some opening comments, and then we'll pause and transition to some questions that I have for them, and then we'll go to you all for some additional questions, which are always very lively. So I'd like to introduce first here on my left, Hetty Milgram, who's the Chief Development Officer at the Jewish Federation of Cleveland. And second, Chuck Miller, who's the Senior Director of Planned Giving here at Case Western Reserve University. And then Hank Dahl, who has many titles, but we're calling him the President and CEO of the Dahl Family Foundation. And they're each going to tell you a little bit more about themselves. But just loosely, if you think about on this side of the table, those who spend their lives working with donors, helping them articulate their wishes and and actualize their giving, and then we're forcing Hank to represent all donors, and he's going to do his best to share from his own personal experience as kind of an exemplar of what we're talking about tonight. So I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to ask Hetty to start us off, and then we'll proceed through our great panel. So thank you for being here.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. First of all, I want to thank the Mandel School for having invited me to participate. It's really quite an honor. And I want to acknowledge that I'm thrilled to be on a panel with a former colleague, Chuck Miller, and the legendary Hank Dahl, who I've been hearing about for years and thrilled to meet. And I also want to point out that I have a former colleague in the back, Mary Ann Lax, who is Development Director here at Mandel's School for Applied Social Sciences, and my current colleague, Ann Garson, whose name I've already mentioned to somebody here. Ann is the Managing Director of our Funds and Foundations at the Federation, and she works with multi-generational family philanthropy, and can write the book on what we're talking about, so she could as easily be sitting here as me. But I have to just say, I just love this topic, inside the mind of the donor. To get to sit here and talk with you a little bit about something that I do all day long, every day, is trying to think about what is it that motivates the donors with whom I work. And truthfully, just as Rob pointed out, motivates each of us. You know, do we sit and think a little bit about what it is that motivates us to want to do something for others, to part with that hard-earned cash, those resources that we've spent so long developing, and for which, in return, there's no tangible benefit. Obviously, other benefits, but no tangible benefit. So how do we measure those good feelings that come? So my part in today's panel is to share with you a few stories of what's motivated some of the donors with whom I've been working. And Chuck is going to follow with some specific examples of different philanthropic vehicles and how those can enhance a donor's intent to do good and achieve personal financial goals. And he's got stories around that. And Hank is going to follow, as Rob said, by sharing his own inspirational story. So I want to begin by sharing a bit about the Federation and what motivates so many in our Jewish community to both contribute to and through the Federation. What is the root of Jewish philanthropy? I think it's important to understand that. And in talking about getting into the mind of a donor, not only do we need to understand the various personal motivations, but the larger communal influences that are and that exist. And in this case, that larger communal influence is the impact of a religious faith on philanthropy. In the case I'll talk about, Judaism. So I think it's important to start with definitions. I always like there to be clarity when we're talking about topics like this. When we talk about giving money away or contributing to a cause, we often use the words charity and philanthropy interchangeably. In the Jewish community, we have a third term, tzedakah, and though it's complementary, the words don't carry the same meanings. And that's an important distinction to make in trying to understand the mind of a donor. Charity comes from the Latin word caritas, which means giving money or alms, usually out of love, but specifically for taking care of the poor. So examples would be giving to the food bank, to United Way, to a homeless shelter. These are all examples of charity. Philanthropy is a concept that came from the Greeks, and it literally means love of mankind. It refers to nourishing and developing what it means to be human, without regard to those in need. And this is where supportive arts organizations, hospitals, universities, those kinds of things come into, just to name a few. Tzedakah is the Hebrew word for justice. Now, some think that it also means charity, but the difference is that tzedakah is an obligation. Everyone in the Jewish community, regardless of their ability to give, is obligated to give something. It is what is considered being righteous. It is justice. Charity is typically understood as a spontaneous act of goodwill and a marker of generosity. So it's a voluntary rather than an obligatory act. So that brings me back to the mission of the Federation. Federation was founded in 1903 by a group of leaders who were involved in several already existing Jewish organizations, mostly social service agencies here in Cleveland. Each agency was conducting its own fundraising campaigns every year, and by and large going to the same donors over and over again. These leaders got together and said there has to be a better way than all of these organizations coming to us multiple times a year. So the concept of federated giving was born, and a few years later this led to the creation of United Way. The reasons for Jewish social service agencies dates back to the early 1650s when Peter Stuyvesant, who was governor of New Amsterdam, reluctantly let the Jews who came over from Europe stay in the United States, stay in what was then New Amsterdam, with the proviso that they take care of their own community. So that led to the establishment of Jewish hospitals, social service agencies, orphanages, etc. So the tradition of taking care of our own community exists today, but we are more of an open tent rather than a closed system. By and large, our Jewish agencies today serve both the Jewish and the general communities. Today, we're a complex organization with many program areas and various planning and overseas agendas. Our 2016 campaign, which we just concluded a few months ago, raised close to $31 million. Those funds were then allocated to 16 local beneficiary agencies that cover the needs of the community from cradle to grave, and also support our overseas partners in Israel, former Soviet Union, and 70 countries throughout the world. Very simply, we aspire to leave no community member behind. Our work is to provide the resources to help our community thrive and survive now and into the future. There were just over 11,000 donors to that annual campaign that I just mentioned to you. Several thousand were solicited face-to-face by volunteers and staff. What motivates so many people to give so generously and to ask others to give? Well, it gets back to tzedakah, to the impact of that Jewish lens. We feel the obligation to take care of our community. And here I want to give my own personal example. The gift that my husband and I give every year to the annual campaign of the Federation is our single largest contribution. We feel that sense of obligation deep in our hearts and souls. My parents were Holocaust survivors, and it was because there were federations 70 years ago that collected funds in a communal way that allowed for the rehabilitation and the resettlement of my parents and so many hundreds of thousands of others, and helped them come to this country. I want to give back. My husband wants to give back and ensure that the resources that existed then, where my family needed them, still exist today and will exist into the future. We're also motivated to give because of the existence of the system of agencies that have taken care of our family literally through every phase of the life cycle of the cycle of our lives. Our children attended the preschool at the Jewish Community Center. Our 3 sons went to a Jewish day school. They were supported in trips to Israel. They benefited from counseling services provided by Belfair. And when my parents moved to Cleveland in the latter years of their lives, they lived at Menorah Park and they received assistance from Jewish Family Service Association. We literally have been enveloped by the community. That feeling of gratitude can really get into your head, and it really got into mine and into the 10,999 other donors as well. So in addition to our annual campaign, the Federation also runs a robust participatory philanthropy program. And this takes us to some of the other reasons I wanted to discuss briefly about why people give. One of the biggest motivators for a donor to establish a fund or a foundation at the Federation is that they want to leave a legacy to their children, and that legacy can be defined in many ways. For example, last year we opened up a new foundation for a couple in their mid-80s. This couple never thought that they would have the resources that would allow them to establish this kind of foundation. But thanks to their IRAs, which grew over many years, they find that they don't need those assets in their retirement to live on, and so they're going to be able to use those assets to create this foundation. That's the softball I'm throwing. Their motivation is that they want to pass on to their 3 grown daughters and their grandchildren their legacy. So we met independently with each family member. We have a series of questions that we ask each of them, and we tell them not to discuss this with the other. And these questions evoke memories of the past. They ask them to think about lessons that they've learned from parents and grandparents. What inspires them? Who were their role models? What are the subtle and the not so subtle messages that they got from those around them who were influences in their lives? And then we collated those answers, and we had a feedback session where we presented all of this information to them, had a very wonderful discussion, and after that we crafted a mission statement for this foundation. Now, the mission statement reflected back the family's strong priorities on education and on special needs populations. So we're now set to have a first foundation meeting, a first grant-making meeting in the fall. And we're selecting a date that will work for all the people who are out of town, because some of the kids live out of town, some of the grandkids live out of town. Even for this family who was already very close to each other, going through this process helped them find an even greater closeness, and knowing that they have this shared legacy is something that they can continue to build on and feel terrific about in the future. Okay, so I've shared a story about obligation, and I've shared a story about family legacy. The last story I want to share is about those donors who give because of recognition. Many donors are driven by a desire to be remembered, and the reasons why are as many and varied as the donors themselves. I worked for a very, very long time with a donor who was driven by the tragedy of having lost a daughter to suicide. And he spent the past 20 years finding ways through his philanthropy to ensure that she would be remembered. Even though she died before she could reach her full potential, it was so important to him that she be remembered. He knew that she loved children, and so he dedicated his retirement years to funding projects that benefited children all over Northeast Ohio. The one stipulation was that his daughter be memorialized in some fashion so that people would always remember her name. As his trusted advisor, I knew what he would think about a potential project and could advise those seeking funds whether or not he would be open to it. I knew what was inside his mind because of the relationship we built over many, many years. And we talked, and we had many meetings, and over those times, he became comfortable sharing his deepest thoughts. And that all added to our relationship in helping to facilitate his philanthropy. And that's the last point I want to make right now. For those of you who are considering a career in development, there's no substitute in learning how to listen. learning to ask open-ended questions that allow your donor to open up and share thoughts that are not always easily or readily expressed. Each person has a unique story and is uniquely motivated to want to do something good in the world. Take time to build the relationship that allows for the sharing of these hopes and dreams. Make sure that the center of every interaction that you have with that donor, instead of focusing on the what or the how, focuses on the why. You focus on the factor. The why factor is what gets at the heart and soul of the work that I do at the Federation and at the work that each of you do. It's what motivates us each and every day. It truly makes me feel like I'm doing holy work. And with that, I want to turn it over to Chuck.
Terrific. Hetty and I are fundraisers, and we have the privilege of meeting folks and helping to create philanthropic dreams come true. So I think we typically, when we are out in the world talking to donors and prospects, we begin with a thank you. So let me thank the Schlang family, their philanthropic fund, for hosting us today, along with the Mandel Center. These are great forums to share ideas, and I hope what we can do is have a conversation. Hetty was talking about some of you who may be thinking about a career transition. Over a decade ago, I made one. Early in my career, I used to both sue and defend nonprofits, charitable organizations, and then I decided, friends in Cleveland told me about this wonderful Case Western Reserve nonprofit program, and Rob was one of my professors, and I couldn't tell you at the time, but I'm not sucking up now where I can tell you, he's one of the tops, if not in this state, in the country. And these buildings on campus are filled with really remarkable people. So and they share what they know. So if you are thinking about a career in nonprofit, feel free to get acquainted and talk to me too. I'm happy to share my journey. Today's topic, I think, is a great one, inside the mind of a donor. I spend most of my day trying to understand what a donor is interested in. It is essential for me to be able to do my job well. I really need to know what a donor is thinking. What are their goals? What are their needs? And Hetty gave me the softball question. I think that in my view, there's three ways for people to make gifts. There's spontaneous giving. At the end of each year, you go to the grocery store, someone's ringing a bell, and if you want to drop some money into the kettle for the Salvation Army, that's spontaneous. You don't really think much about it. There's checkbook charity. And I think this is where, folks get a call from a friend or sometimes it's a telemarketer. They get an envelope in the mail. I met with a 94-year-old yesterday. This stack of envelopes, it's a lesson for us that are involved in fundraising, and she gives, I think she told me her tax return had over 100 charities listed. So there's checkbook charity, it's a quick transaction. You don't think much about it. And then I think there's charity, the third that Rob mentioned at the beginning of his remarks. It's the top level, kind of what we're going to talk about today. Some folks call it major gifts. In my world, in the Office of Planned Giving at the university, I think of it as strategic giving. There should be a strategy. Sometimes, what's the best asset to give? We have folks that are really interested in doing something special, but they don't know how to do it. So a little bit of strategy, what's the right asset? We have folks that may have the right asset. They sold a business. They have some wealth that they want to do something with, but they don't know where. And so there are, those kinds of components. And, I sleep pretty well at night, but my one fear is often that someone will sell their stock and then cut a check to charity. Well, there's a tax benefit if folks would make a gift to charity directly from their securities account, and Hetty mentioned IRAs. So, having conversations with folks who are thinking about doing something marvelous is really the win-win. It's where visions become reality, and I can't tell you how many times folks cry realizing that they can create the endowment in their beloved mother's name, in honor of a professor who taught them the tools to be successful in life. So Hetty mentioned, some of the vehicles, the types of assets that people have, and really my comment would be, I used to make a joke that there's more types of gifts than Baskin-Robbins has flavors. But I really think it's more stars than are in the universe. There are so many ways that people can give. And, I think that's kind of not really a funny story, but organ donation. Every year I get at least 2 calls for organ donation. There's no tax deduction involved, but there are people, often they're physicians, who want others to learn. And it's a very personal, moving experience when people know whether, it's a gift of cash, it's a gift of stock, it's a gift of something else. So, we can talk throughout today's session about these different kinds of ways to give. But I think what's really intriguing is that people give at all, especially, in the 21st century. Folks have lots of worries. The economy is bad. They don't know what the stock market is going to do. It's unpredictable what their health is going to be. I want to save for nursing home care. My grandkids need to go to college, and case is really expensive. And yet my role is to try to talk to folks about how they should give away their hard-earned treasure. Despite, some of these uncertainties in life. And I often think back to what Hetty mentioned. We have written evidence that the idea of philanthropy, of charity, is thousands of years old. And if you look at all of the religions, whether in Judaism it's tzedakah, in Christianity alms, in Islam zakat, one of the pillars of Islam, there is this tradition of trying to help others. And I think, one of the reasons is probably altruism. It feels good to help other people, even if you're giving away your assets. So I guess my topic is a little bit, why do people do it? Is there science behind why people choose to give away the money that, they're taught to save, right? They're worried about their money running out, yet they step up big, and fundraisers talk about stretch gifts. And so I want to share a little bit of the science behind giving, and quickly 2 fields: behavioral research. And the bottom line is that when it comes to charitable giving, donors are ruled by their heart and not the head. And I think that's a really important fundamental concept. When we get bogged down in all kinds of facts and figures, the job of the fundraiser is to try to be an open gate, find a way to make it happen. When someone has a goal to do something special, we need to really be able to find a way to do it. And the behavioral research suggests that what most of us identify with in giving is a single human being. It's the story of one. I remember 40 plus years ago, there was a TV commercial. Maybe some of you remember it. Not a whole lot of words in the commercial, but it was a Native American with a tear going down his cheek. And the whole message was ecology, right? Don't pollute. I think "don't pollute" were the only words at the bottom of the screen, and yet you remember it all of these years later. It was the story of that one Native American who it turned out not to be Native American. So that is what I think compels lots of people. They connect the statistics, and I love the numbers, but the statistics sometimes are so huge it becomes less effective. And if we can move people by the story of one, what we learn is giving is contagious, and sharing stories are exemplary, and I think that it makes great influence on others, and so that's a little bit of the behavioral. And then one more science, and this is from the laboratory. It's neuroimaging. This is MRIs are being used. You put someone in the MRI machine and ask them questions. And in my field of planned giving, these strategic gifts, when the researchers ask about, typically, why do you give through your will, bequest gifts, MRIs light up and show you what part of the brain is activated. And believe it or not, the brain lights up when asked about bequests. And if you're interested in the research, Russell James at Texas Tech, he's fabulous. He's really cool findings. And the parts of the brain that light up when asked about these kinds of planned gifts deal with emotion and memory. And so here's my thought for those of you that in your own lives are talking to folks about giving. What's important is the donor's personal story. You hear about building relationships, but it's the connections, it's the autobiographical connection that people have to the cause. And I can spout all kinds of tax reasons why people can give, and maybe there's going to be questions later, so I don't want to jump the shark on that one. But I just encourage, and I try to remind myself, my time, 85-90% of the time is learning about why David and Dina Donor, were happy on this campus, and how they fell in love, and their favorite professors, and what their coursework meant to them. We'll find a way to move the strings to help make the gift, but them sharing their story is priceless. So for those of you, again, thinking about getting into this field, it's an awesome one. For those of you that are in it and may be able to find jobs that pay more somewhere else, this is our reward, because you meet these families that just truly do, change one person, and it changes the world. So glad to be here. Turn it over to Hank.
After hearing these two, I feel like I ought to be opening up my head so that all of you can look inside, because the idea is the mind of the donor, but the whole idea also here is education. And that I had this image of the head being open and the education being poured in somewhere that was in my history. Anyway, I want to say thanks also to Gail and her husband for sponsoring this event. It's nice to be here. I have to confess that what Hetty had to say about philanthropy and charity, I really hadn't ever tracked on the difference. So I'm going to talk just about philanthropy, and I'm going to talk to why I have a passion for philanthropy, and I've had it ever since I was a kid. It began with my religious upbringing. My parents and my church taught me the importance of giving. The church taught that everything we have, our life, our resources, our very being, comes from God. Therefore, we must show our appreciation and give back a portion of what has been given to us. That was the message of the church. My folks gave me an allowance. How many of you had an allowance when you were kids? Ah, yes, you know what this is. And they asked me to put a nickel in an envelope that was much smaller than this one, put that nickel, which was just part of my allowance, in a collection plate in the envelope, and then put it in the collection plate as a symbol of showing my gratitude to God. And so I did that every Sunday. Now, lest you think that my philanthropic upbringing was all honest and morally upright, a little story will set the record straight. When I was in grade school, we had a contest every year to see which homeroom could raise the most money for the community chest, now called the United Way. As one entered that grade school building, one could see a chart with airplanes taking off on this chart on a bulletin board in the hallway. And my class's plane wasn't doing very well. So I took $20 without getting permission from my dad's pay envelope and donated it in order to put my class over the top. We won. But my parents weren't at all happy. During my growing up years, my dad modeled for me, he was an industrialist, he modeled for me what philanthropy was all about. He was one of our city's foremost volunteers who spent many hours working on community service projects. Among other things, he was president of the YMCA, the local Rotary Club, and for many years, president of United Way. He was also one of the founders, and after his retirement, the unpaid director of the Erie Community Foundation. Only then it was called the Erie Endowment. At our dinner table, he often talked about the importance of what these organizations were doing for the people of Erie, Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up. He was proud of the city's philanthropic spirit. Now I'm going to jump. It wasn't until I graduated from Yale Divinity School, however, that I personally got involved with philanthropy in a big way. My first job was with the Cummins Engine Company in Columbus, Indiana. Now you can imagine a divinity student going there. But I was there with all the engineers and graduates of Harvard Business School learning how to put together and take apart a diesel engine. My title, though, was Foundations Administrator. First and foremost with the Cummins Engine Foundation, a corporate foundation. Then with the Irvin Sweeney Miller Foundation, a family foundation. And eventually as reviewer of the Ford Foundation's quarterly docket. I did the latter because Irwin Miller, who was Cummins chairman at the time, served on the Ford Foundation board. And he wanted a ghostwriter and a ghost evaluator. At that time, I was impressed with Ford's ability to use philanthropic dollars to demonstrate new approaches to community problem solving and to significantly influence some of our federal government's policies and practices. And they did. I mean, they really had an impact on what came out of the legislature there in Washington. My next big step in the field of philanthropy that actually brought me to Cleveland was to write a thesis on community foundations as a means of obtaining my master's degree in public administration. During my interviewing process with foundation executives sort of throughout the eastern United States, I was offered an internship with the Greater Cleveland Associated Foundation. Now, how many of you remember that? Nobody. Well, it was started by the Ford Foundation as a means of waking up the Cleveland Foundation to be more active in an outgoing way in the community. The funding that the Cleveland Foundation did at that time was pretty stodgy. It's changed considerably since then, but that was the purpose. And then the Community Foundation, or the Associated Foundation, merged into the Cleveland Foundation. and Homer Wadsworth was the first director. My assignment was to, when I was with the Associated Foundation, was to evaluate neighborhood development projects and generally to learn what community foundations were all about. I didn't know very much at all. In fact, when I graduated from college, I didn't really know what a foundation was. I have since learned a good bit. And that has had a big bearing, having been through that experience, that history, has had a big bearing on how I think about giving, how I think about what a foundation does, and how I respond. Now, you made the point about being giving from the heart or giving from the mind, and you had this example of going through an MRI so that you could see what my mind was thinking. And I got kind of confused there because I both give from the heart and give from the mind. And we're talking here today about the mind of the donor. Well, that's the background on the mind of the donor, but I give from the heart. And I would say that my definition of a philanthropy is that you give money, you volunteer, and you participate in community service. And one of the purposes that I learned while I was in graduate school was an idea that had to do with ministry. Richard Niebuhr, who was a professor of mine at Yale, once said, "The ministry is about enabling people to be fully who God created them to be." And all through those years, that's what I thought I was doing. In fact, I had to justify my ministry here in town. I'm a Presbyterian minister, by saying every year, what is my calling? And my calling was to do just what I said, to enable people to be fully who God has called them to be. In many respects, that's what you're doing. If you want to put the word God in there, you're enabling them to be who they are fully. Well, that's the background. When my dad died in 1991, I had the good fortune of inheriting resources from him that enabled me and my wife, Mary, to greatly expand upon our personal philanthropic interests. And in the time remaining, I'd like to share 5 examples of what that entailed and how my life as a donor has grown over the past 25 years. And when I saw Gail come in, there's one thing I should have added, which was a 6th example, which was our effort to get kids involved in philanthropy that went on for years in this town. We helped at one point to establish a giving program that was based in MSAS, the Mandel Center across the street. Well, first, at the time of Mary's death last August, she and I were making monetary gifts to more than 90 charities. These included, as you might assume, our universities and graduate schools, our church, and the institutions that played an important role in our lives and in the lives of our children. They also included many of the organizations that I helped to start when I was a foundation administrator here in town, and also some national organizations that clearly reflected our personal values. Whenever we gave, we always derived a great deal of satisfaction, and I use that word, satisfaction, from giving, and from reading the letters of appreciation that we received from those who received our gifts. And for those of you who are in this business, that's very important, that letter of thank you, or the students who here at MSAS who call, very important. Our big problem again, the mind of the donor, has always been, how do we cut back rather than add to the number of charities we're involved with? The older you get, the more difficult it is to say, well, Oxfam is something we might cut back, until you think about what Oxfam does, and I use that as a national or international organization, but there's so many of them that are local too, that you say to yourself, boy, they're really doing good things in this town. I don't want to cut back. Second, with the support of Mary and my children, our family decided to establish the All Family Foundation in 1993. Since then, the foundation has been making small grants, maximum size $7,000, and in Cleveland and in the places where our kids live. We focused on 3 priorities: the promotion of philanthropy, as you might guess, and I could give examples of all these. One example I will give is a grant we made in Seattle where our kids lived to something called the Penny Harvest. It was for kids in public schools who could spend some time raising pennies in their homes and families and so forth, and bring them together, and then they gave them away. That was the Penny Harvest. By the time this thing really got going, they had a conference in the city for these kids who came from these different grade schools to do this. We were only part of the gift, but that was something we did to promote philanthropy, because if you get the ethic out there early in the minds of kids or in the hearts of kids, they may remember that when they're much older and have the resources to do things. The second emphasis we have is to help women to get back on their feet after experiencing major difficulties and traumas. So an example would be the Rape Crisis Center. And the third area is environmental policy. Believe it or not, we agreed on these priorities when we were attending my second daughter's graduation from college in Montana. We talked about all of this while we were driving out to visit a bison range near her campus. And that happened in the car. I mean, we just had this wonderful response from everybody. I have 4 kids, and at that point, Mary. And we decided then that's what we're going to do. Over the years, we've all greatly enjoyed being part of the foundation because it has provided many opportunities for us to engage with leaders of nonprofit agencies in our own communities and to feel that our contributions are making a difference. And that's a big part of the mind of a donor, too. You want to feel like what you're doing makes a difference. We also appreciated the chance to collaborate with other funders. We have with the Gun Foundation, a number of foundations here in town, to be part of implementing new ideas and initiatives, to provide challenge grants. You can do a lot with a small amount of money. And once I wrote a paper for Paul Ivelsacher of the Ford Foundation on that very idea. You don't have to have a huge amount of money to make a difference and to provide leverage for something to happen. And many of you will discover that, or if you haven't, I hope you do, because there's a lot of satisfaction in that. Perhaps most importantly, my kids are now all interested in the field of philanthropy, and the foundation has drawn us closer together as a family, which is exactly what Hetty was talking about. I don't know how else to say that, except that it's been a wonderful vehicle for our coming together, talk about issues and ideas, but about personal relations too. Third, early in our marriage, Mary and I purchased a mutual fund for the purpose of paying for our kids' education. I don't want to go too long here. Have I?
No, No, not at all.
Oh, okay.
You've got two or three more examples you got to give.
Yeah, well, I've got.
You got to finish
I've
the
got
list.
two. I'll finish my list. We bought this mutual fund for the purpose of their education, but when we realized we didn't need it for that purpose, we decided that the two of us ought to split the proceeds and each give to our favorite charity. I gave to my university to establish a lectureship on the topic of religion and money. Mary gave to Northwestern University for the purpose of creating a scholarship for undergraduate students interested in pursuing a career in medicine, which was her field. Our gifts amounted to $100,000 each on an investment of $2,000. Pretty good return, wouldn't you say? Over 45 years. Yeah. Fourth, as some of you have heard from others who have spoken, I guess I don't really need to spend much time on this. I started in 2003 a giving circle, and we call it the Giving Back Gang. That's ours. I won't spend much time on that, except to say that we have a problem with that circle. We're all getting older. But it's a wonderful way to learn about the city. It's a wonderful way to invest in the city and in things that are going on in the city. And it's a great fellowship kind of experience to bring people together and talk about issues that we all care about. Now, for my fifth example and last, I'd like to switch to the fundraising side of philanthropy by mentioning my involvement as co-chair of the Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry's $5.5 million successful capital campaign. In this effort, I learned a lot about the psychology of donors. Not going into that, because Chuck did that. What I want to share, however, is my view that what led to our success was our campaign committee's strong belief in the organization and all that it does to meet the needs of local people. The ministry's biblical mantra, taken from the book of Micah, really resonated with us. It is a simple verse that says, many of you know it, "What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." That has become my mantra over the years, not just in that campaign. So I'd like to conclude by paraphrasing the book I brought with me, written by a professor who lectured in the Religion and Money series at Princeton. The book is by Christian Smith and his colleague Hilary Davidson, and is entitled The Paradox of Generosity. That's the name of it. At the sort of underlying thing on the cover is, "Giving we receive, grasping we lose." And he sort of compares the ungenerous with the generous. And from their research, they're able to say that generous people tend to live better lives, are happier, live with greater sense of purpose, and express and experience less depression. What an incentive, huh? I guess this helps to explain about my passion for philanthropy, what it's meant to me, and why I'm still at it.
Fantastic. Well, our fine panel has rendered many of my questions irrelevant by their sweeping handling of this topic. So I'm scrambling to formulate. So you all be thinking of questions as we do a little section on with some facilitated questions. I wanted to go back to this point about motivation generally, and we had some wonderful examples about motivations that donors can actualize through their gifts. But I wanted to see if we could tap a little bit more on the personal values, how personal values figure into this. And we heard about upbringing and the influence of religious tradition on individuals. In the face of, I think what Chuck said, no tangible benefits. And sorting out, what's in it for me. I'm reminded frequently, because I have a 15-year-old at home, who constantly says to me, why are you giving money to them? Why don't you keep our money for us? And so apparently I'm not modeling very well, or maybe it's just being 15. He doesn't understand why when on the one hand where we talk about how things are tight and how we have to invest in things for the family, why we turn around and make gifts. So I just wonder if we could hear maybe a couple more illustrations about how you've seen individuals where part of their own life experience has been influential in their decision to make a gift that you've been perhaps a part of, and where those personal values have been really formative in that decision about the gift process. Does anything come to mind?
I would ask a question. I wonder if that is more likely to happen when people are older. That's my question for it. I'm not the one you're asking.
You're allowed to ask questions.
I'm going to
That's a
give an
great point.
example. We're sitting in a building with the name Mandel on it, and I have the great privilege to be the secretary of the supporting foundations, the Jack, Joseph, and Morton, the three supporting foundations that are managed by the Federation, and there's also the private foundation. There's not a meeting that we have with Morton, we just had one a few weeks ago, where he doesn't talk about the values that his parents, particularly his mother, instilled in him about giving back, about how she opened her home, how she gave food to places, how she, to people in need, and it was this sense of always doing for others, and that this was the right thing to do, no matter how little they had at the time, that created for him the foundation for wanting to give back when he became in a position to be able to do that. And one of the first things that he and his brothers did when they achieved some financial success was to create philanthropic vehicles for giving, and they give and continue to give, and now in his later years, though he certainly has a long way to go. In the Jewish tradition, we say you should live to be 120. Mort's only 94. He has a long way to go, and he's going to make it. He has ensured that there will be significant funding going forward for years to come to be able to impart his values. He's done a lot with his foundation to catalog those values in ways that are teachable to the world. He wrote a book that has actually sold all around the world called It's All About Who, and that's one of his greatest values is it's about the people that you hire, it's about the people that you have around you, and the power of people to make a difference in the world. And he's lived his values.
And I'll make a plug for Chuck was very kind to bring some copies of this report, which is out on the table if you'd like a copy, that I think speaks very closely to individuals' connections with the university. It illustrates case examples of how donors to this university are really tapping their own experiences and connections, as Chuck mentioned in his comments. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that piece.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that book. Folks that have made a planned gift to the university are part of a recognition society. Lots of charities have recognition societies, and the donors have no idea why they're in them. We create these labels based on the amount that somebody gives, the type of gift, for us, the school that they're at. And our hope is to, get better acquainted with people. And so for our planned giving recognition group, Luminary Society, Barbara Snyder believes that folks that make a planned gift light the path for future generations. It's beautiful. So we sent letters to all of the Luminary Society members asking them to tell us their story. Why do you support us? And that book is a collection of the responses. We were overwhelmed that people took the time. We got emails, letters, we got archival photographs. They're all in the book. People shared their values. It was giving for, in the name of their daughter. I think we've mentioned sometimes memorial giving for the teacher who put them on the right path. That's a value. And you know, I don't want to get into the weeds about the book. There was no ask. There was no solicitation. Though lots of people gave. You know, the comment that I really want to make about the values, you know, in some ways, we get the opportunity to work with people who can perpetuate those values forever. And that's the plan gifts that create endowments. And those are really special opportunities. I know leadership loves the gifts that come in. They're unrestricted, and we get to decide where to use them today. Super, super important. But endowments that were created by walk around these buildings on campus, Rockefeller and other legendary names, Smith, and on it goes. These endowments help provide the funds for tomorrow's students. They help provide the funds, and I think that's a great way that your values live on. We work really tirelessly to make sure that the gift documents get it right, so that the values, we want the students to know who David and Dina Donor are, and you know what they wanted to support. So those values are reflected in gift documents that need to stand the test of time. They may be for unrestricted operating, terrific, important, but sometimes those values last forever in these endowment funds. They've been used to create the community foundations and the corporate foundations. You know, the legacy here in Cleveland now, over 100 years old, many of these, and I think that's something that all of us have a real responsibility to honor those values. So it's not just the donor's value at the time they make the gift. We want to do whatever we can to make it forever.
I want to take us back for a moment to the beginning when Hetty offered us the kind of distinction between charity, philanthropy, and tzedakah. In a recent study by the Lilly School of Philanthropy, they found that the leading motivation for charitable giving was to provide for basic needs, so that charity category. And this was a national sample of donors, and they found that that was significantly more true in the Great Lakes region, including Ohio. That charity was more of a motivation to give to basic needs. And I was thinking about the history in Cleveland, the federated giving model, the community chest and United Way. I just wonder that when I talk to folks in national circles in the nonprofit sphere, they have a perception of Cleveland as being ahead, having been ahead on this front, having been a rich tradition, but still continuing today. And I just wonder, do you have thoughts about, are we different? Is it just that we think we're different and we have these fantastic institutions that we've created over a century? Or is there something about the ethos in Northeast Ohio that has...
Is there something in the water?
It's something in the water.
No, we talk about that. We think there's something in the water.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It's recognized throughout the country. The Cleveland Federation is recognized as the model federation. If you look on a chart as to per capita net assets of our endowment, for instance, you'll see, here's the line, here's Cleveland, the next foundation, the next community, which I think might be San Francisco or New York, is over here. The rest are like this. We are outsized in our philanthropy, and it's not just in the Jewish community. It's true in the entire community. 3 or 4 years ago, Margaret Bernstein, who used to write for The Plain Dealer, did a wonderful series. It was in December, I remember, at the end of the year, on philanthropy. The first one was about the Jewish community, and she'd interviewed a number of us. And then she went on to talk about all these other segments. I don't know if any of you remember it, but it's worth looking up on the internet. It's remarkable what has come out of Cleveland and continues in Cleveland. And I think that it has a lot to do with the families. And it gets back to when we talk about the legacies that families pass on to each other. There is a tradition of families who live in Cleveland, who have built the city, who continue to stay involved, and come back to the city if they've moved away. And I think that's one of those things that's kept this community strong. It's that continuity of leadership, that dedication over and over again to this community and what one can achieve here.
So there is something in the
I
water.
think so.
Thank
Well,
you.
there is. Well, the first community foundation was here. And I used to like telling the story about Rockefeller talking to Frederick Goff. You must have heard this story where the bet was between Rockefeller and Goff. Goff was the founder of the Cleveland Foundation. That someday it would be bigger than the Rockefeller Foundation, simply because of the way in which people give to it, and it's an open door. I mean, it's just constantly a growing foundation. I don't know whether that's true. Do you know whether that's true, Chuck?
Which
I
has
think-
more assets?
Yes,
Um,
because
they're filming me, so I do believe the Cleveland Foundation is bigger.
I think it's gotten to be bigger. Because the only way that the Rockefeller Foundation grows is by virtue of the management of their assets.
Right, investment return.
Mm-hmm.
And the Cleveland
But
Foundation continues
Keeps to get people,
support.
generous
Dan's looking
people.
it up. We're going to find out. Rockefeller's bigger?
What's the number?
Dan is.
Dang.
Oh, that's about twice as big, right?
Wow.
All right, I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to go to the audience for some questions. We heard, Chuck, I think you used the phrase about donor engagement and relationship building, and there's a whole movement in the sector around this. I always get a little nervous as a donor about what this means. What does it mean that a relationship is being built with me, with the hope that at some point I could be potentially a major donor? But I just wonder how that's changed, how that changes how donors interact with, if we go to the 90 organizations or however many that an individual donor might be involved with. I can barely manage a few relationships in my life. I don't know how many donor relationships I could manage, or potential requester relationships. Could you just help us understand what does that really mean? What does that mean to individuals who might be donors when we're interacting with folks in development?
Well, if back in the day when you went to the bank, you like to have the same person handle your account because you could get to know them and trust them. When you go to the doctor, the same thing. You typically like to go to the same person because he knows you. It's the values that we were talking about, and you know, you're on the same page, and on it goes with professionals, and I think more heightened fiduciaries, people that are in a position of trust. I think it's really helpful to have that relationship, to have to start over with a different doctor every time you go in. So maybe in some ways, you know, philanthropy, you know, a nice model is to try to do the same, to build that relationship so that we are on the same page, so that we do have these connections, so that, you know, again, we want to be that open gate. We want to make it easy. And if you're always starting over, how frustrating would that be? So I hope that's kind of responsive to your question. I think the relationship is kind of, you know, two-sided. You know, does the donor want to have the same relationship? And in many ways, especially for these bigger gifts, when you're creating an endowment, it can take a long time. You're rolling up sleeves, you're working together, documents can be going back and forth, there's some research involved, you know, and then there can be what's next, and you know, what's the asset and what's the timing. So again, it's you know, I think you have to have those connections because people are sharing really intimate information. People may share financial pieces that they don't tell anyone else except the person who does their taxes and you know. So I think that, again, that relationship to me is, and I know this is in Washington, there is a difference between who is a fiduciary and you know, who is just a transactional broker flipping a switch and selling you something. I would hate to think, you know, this is not selling something. This is a fiduciary. This is a much deeper, complex, I hope, bond.
Let me make one tweak to that, and that is, so if someone's committed as a donor, the idea of working with the same person to articulate my wishes is very attractive. But if you go back one step to, at any point in time, you have some people who volunteer with the organization, but they're not donors. You have other people who are small givers, and you want them to give more. You want volunteers to give money. That sort of building relationship over time, not from the individual, but from the organization. And I wonder whether that, I imagine by the time somebody gets to you, they've come all the way up that evolution.
Well, it's remarkable, that evolution. So for the university, you know, most of us today, you know, have donor databases that include contact information and history of giving, and you know, now for many, you know, these are many decades of giving, and you see people that have consistent consecutive giving. Rob, sometimes it's $10 a year. It then becomes $25. It then becomes $100. I try not to presume. I don't know the millionaire next door. But those folks are telling us something by continuing to give. They're building a relationship. And I'll tell you, you know, those different kinds of giving, the spontaneous checkbook and the strategic, folks that give the gift of their time are telling us something as well. And so sometimes it's not just the record that they've been giving, but they're giving their time. That deserves to be cultivated. And most organizations, whether you're a university or you're a hospital, there's places that you can plug people that have the passion. If they're spending their time with you, then maybe they're worth getting to know.
I guess, Hetty, maybe you could just help me. The phrase that always kind of gets under my skin is prospecting, donor prospecting. It makes me feel like I'm a raw mineral.
Yeah, we never use that phrase. That's not a phrase we use. The ultimate for us is to become that trusted advisor. I mentioned that in relationship to one of the donor stories I told. And getting back to relationship building, I know it's a little different than what you were asking about. What I think is the most important key is that when I'm working with a donor, what matters most is what matters most to that donor, not what matters most to the organization. It's thinking about the motivations, getting back to the topic here, it's thinking about what the motivations are. And I don't do my job properly if I'm not keeping in mind what the best interests are of that donor and what that donor really wants to achieve through his or her philanthropy. And when you get to that point where you do that, then you really have an authentic relationship, and that donor knows that they can keep coming back to you, and you're going to be able to work with them in ways that are going to yield the most benefit to them. I also talk about the peripheral vision. Anne's heard me say this a lot of times. Thinking about what are the other things besides what you're involved with, if you're working specifically with an organization, what are the other things that the donor's interested in, and always keeping those in mind. It's that thinking of the donor as a complete and total person, not just as it interfaces with the organization I'm working with.
Great
I'd just add one thing. As someone who's given over 90 charities and who's observing what's going on in the world, there are a lot of people that want to establish that long-time relationship with you, the kind they're describing. And that's not bad, but it's just that relationships can get out of hand. You have too many of them.
Right.
All right, we're going to press pause here. We're going to go to the audience, and I think the lovely Marianne Lax is going to have a microphone. If we have a question, if you could raise your hand, and Marianne will come to you, and a question or comment. for the panel. Don't be shy.
Thank you for sharing. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Dahl, you are clearly someone who is happier as you've given more over the years, and being able to, of course. But it seems that what it's done is it's brought you meaning. And you've created meaning for yourself, you've made meaning for others, and that's really something to see. I wondered what advice you might give to other philanthropists who would like to bring along the rest of their family or their adult children on this journey with them, but who may not have laid the groundwork as well as you have?
That is a very good question. And I know it comes from your own experience with families that haven't done it very well. And I'm aware of that. I'd say one thing about our experience is that we started early. Our kids were still in high school. And a number of families do that sort of thing. They'll give, if they have a foundation already, they'll have the young people in the family, the children and grandchildren, have a role and ease them in that way. But in creating a foundation, or in trying to bring along your young people, it's a real challenge because sometimes they don't want to have anything to do with giving away money or thinking about anything but their own future and their own livelihood. And I don't mean to say that negatively. It's just that that's not where their values are or where their motivation is. And it's a challenge, I think, my son wasn't really on board when we started. Now he's the one who's advocating for women's issues, which is surprising to me. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, though, because it's...
What turned it for your son? What turned him?
I think it's the fact that I have 3 daughters. And they started talking about these issues, and Eric got very interested in knowing more about what organizations that work with women are doing and achieving. That's the best way I can answer. I mean, it's just sort of, it carried him. But I can tell you, I worked with the Firestone Foundation years ago, and they agreed to disagree. They split up the foundation. There is no Firestone Foundation anymore, and yet Firestone is a name that everybody knows. There are small portions of that fairly large asset that now have gone to the members of the family because they couldn't agree on anything.
Maybe I could just turn that question just a hair to see if Hetty or Chuck have a comment. As individual donors make decisions about large gifts and potentially bequests, one consideration they have is ensuring for the security of their children, grandchildren, their own family. And I just wonder how you help them think through that when, their wishes are to make this big lasting impact, but then there's also kind of the more provincial concern about one's children. And is that just part of the discussion about
It's all part of the discussion, and the first thing I'll talk with any family about is, especially if they're thinking, oh, I'm not sure if I've got enough, I really want to do this. First, you take care of your family. That's the most important thing, and in whatever way that means. And once you do that, then let's talk. If there's any angst at all, other times people will come and they'll say, we've taken care of that, there's no issue, they don't need it, or whatever. But, first and foremost, it's very important to take care of your own family.
On the other hand, there is a debate with regard to that, because if one of your children isn't, so to speak, pulling his oar and is looking forward to the inheritance, that can be a negative.
Right, but so I said, in whatever way that means to you. So that's subtly trying to get at the point that everyone's going to have a different way of looking at what taking care means, and we do have a lot of discussions with people of substantial means who are leaving a substantial amount of their philanthropy, of their net assets to philanthropy, and saying, we know our kids are going to be able to make it. They can deal with it. This is, and we've given them like a little bit or whatever, but this is our money to deal with. So it is a personal decision
Oh, I
and
agree.
everything. Yeah.
Wanted to show the other side.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're 100% right.
One of the inspirations that Rob and others have worked for having this type of colloquium going on is the fact that we're on a campus, and it's not unlike a lot of other most other campuses, with a very huge variety of individuals coming from different socioeconomic, different countries, different religions, different everything. And the question is, to you all, and perhaps particularly relevant since it's a campus to Chuck, how do you begin to make the students, where you're not the parents, you're not the relatives, you don't have those relationships, to begin to recognize that the Mandel building is not forever. It may have the name forever, it may grow, but what's going on inside needs support. And you're looking at students who obviously may not have 2 dimes to rub right now, but they may have 1 dime to be able to give. One student from here has started thinking about this in relationship to giving circle concept or whatever. So what advice would you give to particularly a student who is trying to get his or her cohorts to think the way that you all are talking about?
It's a really interesting question, and I think traction comes at a different pace for some of the reasons that you described. There are some students that have a history of giving from their youngest days. I know at Federation there are some children at their first birthday, the parents make a gift in their honor for the annual fund. By the time the kid is in high school, they're psyched because they're going to continue that 18th year of giving, and it's really powerful. So you have some students, in the book that Rob mentioned, one of the donors mentioned, where their philanthropy came from was a charity box, very similar to your envelope, where as a young boy you put a nickel in. So some of that traction begins well before they come to campus. And you have campus organizations, fraternities, and many more that are doing philanthropic things for the community beyond the grounds of this campus. You have some students from global communities where their culture of giving is very different. But they come and they see and they hear and they participate in other clubs and organizations, so it begins getting in. So, I do believe that there is a place for young people to give, and oftentimes, Gail, it begins with the gift of their time. Again, I see some of our database information folks that are giving deep where it's $5 and $10, but they're 22 years old and starting in their career. So, and others have completely different situations. Their family had a philanthropic fund. We can talk about those things, and they're making recommendations when they're young kids about where the family's dollars can go and the good that it. So this is to Hetty's point, where every donor is unique, and you're trying to meet a mutual understanding of their goals, their needs, their interests. The days of charities coming out and saying, we want, this is a proposal, we want to, jam it, and this is what that really isn't successful. So starting when kids are really young, well before they're on college, but when they're on college, again, we're hoping that they're having positive experiences that, they're going to learn the tools of their trade, that one day they can do these bigger gifts. So I hope that's responsive.
I'd answer that one other way, and I think I'm only building on what you're saying, Chuck, but the idea would be to have a number of opportunities for college kids to volunteer, particularly as a group somewhere in the community. Not necessarily to have to give to it, but in the process of giving, I'm aware of something my class did and is doing in college, is having groups of students who are undergraduates go to prisons to help teach, tutor. And my only point would be that they aren't they're giving of themselves, but they're learning something that may change the way they think about life and about the way in which if they do have resources somewhere down the line, they might really want to give, to do something like they were doing, or maybe give to the college to make it possible for other kids to do the same thing, to get transportation to, I know, having looked into this a little bit around here, to get kids to the prisons. There aren't any in Cleveland, they're out in Lorain County. But I mean, I've seen in a lot of instances, and this can happen overseas as well, having young people go there, the experience is what changes the mind. And they begin to get educated about, well, how do these people in this particular place pay for it? And I think that's how you get to the point where people say, yeah, oh, well, we can make that happen.
Perhaps I should have given examples. Your remarks make me think. Our students have days of giving. They have days of volunteering. They have, and the list goes on, and there are all kinds of, student projects through the schools, through the clubs, where it is all about charity, philanthropy, community, civic engagement, social work. The School of Dental Medicine having, things, clinics and medical. So there are just so many ways to tap into that. So maybe even if the students haven't been exposed through their childhood, there are so many ways today. And again, through contact with others, the internet. I mean, the students come up with amazing ways to give. We have boards where they spray paint all kinds of philanthropic engagement. It goes on and on.
There's time for one more question.
I guess I'm from that question. I think that specifically, I'm working on this project. Specifically, MSAS is all about giving of our time. I mean, that's what it is to be a social worker. I think that sense of giving is very big here, which is great, but there's a disconnect, it seems to be. How do you make that connection from actions to a more tangible reality? And especially in a field that, especially from a perspective of case where a lot of people go on to become engineers and doctors, which are often more lucrative careers than social work, how to encourage giving even when people are not as comfortable.
So I talk to people who often say, I wish I was Warren Buffett. I want to give more. And I wish I could write a bigger check. What happens is modest gifts are often combined with other modest gifts that do amazing things. So I'm never, is someone who starts off again as a $25 a year donor, I respect. People dig deep, young or old, fixed income, or just not even having an income at this point if you're in school. So there is real power in knowing that those gifts, our annual fund at the university is all about scholarship. So when those students are putting in $10, the day of giving, you're a change agent. It's all about changing lives, $10 at a time. The federated model, community shares, this is what happened in Cleveland. This is the Cleveland model. This is what was so unique in charitable history, people coming together and giving collectively. And so, I hope that students recognize the value of their giving, because, again, when it's matched, when it's combined with other gifts, it's huge.
Sharon, did you have a question?
I just wondered, it was sort of consistent with what you were saying, and I wondered whether or not there might be other ways to approach giving in terms of, for instance, focusing on participation rates as opposed to focusing on, how much, but it's the notion that, sort of a campaign. I'm a part of a small school, and we have a campaign called Every Woman Every Year, which means that the graduation classes actually compete with each other to have in terms of their participation rate in philanthropy, as opposed to just thinking about, sort of a competitive thing. I mean, we're always going to get these large gifts from people that can afford it, but we want to basically underscore the participation and the ability to give regardless of the amount of money, and to give it some value in terms of being able to give people classes awards in terms of the participation rate.
All right, we're really at the close of our time. I want to thank you all for being here. Would you join me in thanking the panel? Also, I'd really like to thank Gail Schlang and her husband Elliot for really sponsoring this series this year and last year. It's been a wonderful opportunity to come together around a very important topic. I hope everybody will join us outside for light refreshments before you head on, and thank you again.